The courtroom, a place where justice is expected to be delivered with fairness and integrity, was charged with anticipation. People filled the seats, some present as spectators, others as legal professionals, each understanding the gravity of the proceedings. The atmosphere was thick with the weight of the moment, and the air carried a quiet tension that comes only when significant matters are at hand. The session began as any other, with routine legal procedures, arguments from attorneys, and statements being placed on record. The individual in focus, an esteemed public figure, had entered the room with the dignity expected of someone in his position. His presence commanded attention, not just because of his title, but due to the influence he wielded in shaping policies and national discussions. While some in the room looked on with admiration, others held their skepticism close, their gazes betraying a certain level of hostility. As the proceedings moved forward, a shift in tone became evident. The authority, overseeing the courtroom expected to be the pillar of impartiality, seemed to waver from the expected decorum. The initial signs were subtle, a lingering pause before speaking, a slight narrowing of the eyes, and a barely concealed smirk that hinted at something brewing beneath the surface. The words that followed were laced with sarcasm, delivered in a manner that was anything but neutral. What had begun as a legal discussion quickly turned into something far more personal. The comments made were not of the kind one would expect from someone sworn to uphold the principles of fairness and justice. Instead, they carried the sharp edge of a personal vendetta, a tone that did not belong in the chambers of law. They were dismissive, laced with an unspoken challenge, each remark cutting deeper than the last. The words rang through the room, their weight making the audience shift uncomfortably. Some exchanged glances, others sat frozen in disbelief. For a brief moment, silence followed. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, a heavy, loaded stillness that filled the space between expectation and reaction. It was clear that lines had been crossed, and not just any lines, but those that separated professionalism from personal bias. The very foundation upon which justice rested had been momentarily shaken, leaving everyone present to wonder if the institution they had trusted was faltering before their eyes. What had been an orderly session had now become an event that would not be easily forgotten. The air grew dense with an unspoken question. How far would this go? The weight of authority, once wielded with a sense of duty, now felt dangerously misused. It was no longer just about the case at hand. It had become a reflection of something deeper, something troubling. The individual at the receiving end of these remarks remained composed. There was no sign of agitation, no response that would indicate offense. Instead, there was a quiet understanding of what was unfolding, a patience that hinted at an awareness beyond the moment. But those watching knew this was far from over. The atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted from tense anticipation to outright disbelief. What had started as a formal legal proceeding had unraveled into something else entirely. The air, once heavy with legal jargon and measured discourse, now crackled with the kind of energy that signaled something extraordinary was about to happen. The authority presiding over the case had overstepped, pushing boundaries that were meant to remain intact. Those present, attorneys, reporters, and spectators alike, exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that the situation had spiraled into dangerous territory. A moment passed where it seemed as if nothing would come of it. The individual at the center of the unexpected verbal attack remained composed, refusing to engage in the hostility that had been directed his way. Perhaps that restraint had been mistaken for submission, for the situation only escalated further. The authority in the room, emboldened by the lack of immediate pushback, continued in the same manner, as if testing the limits of power. Then, without warning, a shift occurred. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the sudden movement caused heads to turn. A group of officials entered, their presence undeniable, their purpose clear. Their expressions were unreadable, but their steps were purposeful, sending an unspoken message that they were not here as mere observers. The room, moments ago buzzing with murmurs and quiet gasps, fell into a stunned silence. Those who had been watching the incident unfold in disbelief now found themselves witnessing something even more shocking. The authority, who had so confidently commanded the courtroom only moments before, was no longer in control. The same seat that had symbolized power and dominance now seemed small, its occupant shifting uncomfortably as the realization set in. The expressions on the faces of the officials said everything that words did not. They were not here to advise, warn, or negotiate. They were here to act. There was no grand announcement, no dramatic confrontation. The process was swift, precise, and final. Instructions were given, and there was no room for defiance. The authority who had once held absolute control in this space was now subject to it, forced to comply in the same manner as those who had stood before them in past cases. The weight of justice, so often wielded by this individual, now bore down upon them. Those watching struggled to process what they were witnessing. The shift in power was undeniable, the irony too sharp to ignore. For years, the one now being escorted away had been the enforcer of order, the final decision-maker in countless cases. And yet, here they were, standing on the other side of the very system they had once represented. The silence that followed was different from the one before. It was no longer a silence of anticipation or disbelief, but one of realization. Something significant had occurred, something that would not be forgotten. Those who had entered the room to serve justice had done so with unwavering resolve. And just like that, control had changed hands. The courtroom had always been a place where power was exercised with a sense of solemnity. Those who entered its doors understood that the authority presiding over it held the ability to alter lives with a single decision. For years, it had been accepted that fairness and neutrality were the guiding principles of the institution. But in that moment, as the events unfolded, it became clear that something had gone terribly wrong. The balance that was meant to keep power in check had been ignored, and now the consequences were inevitable. What had started as an ordinary proceeding had transformed into a display of unchecked arrogance. The authority in charge had allowed personal bias to seep into the very foundation of justice, turning what should have been a fair legal matter into a spectacle of disrespect. There had been no effort to conceal it. Each word spoken had been deliberate, each action calculated. It was as if the role of an impartial figure had been abandoned entirely, replaced with a person drunk on the very power meant to be wielded responsibly. The room had reacted with a mixture of unease and disbelief. Lawyers who had spent years arguing before the court sat frozen, their usual confidence shaken by the blatant disregard for decorum. Reporters, always looking for the next headline, found themselves watching a story unfold before them that they hadn't expected. Even those seated in the audience, who may have had little knowledge of legal proceedings, could tell that a boundary had been crossed. And then, just as quickly as the authority had overstepped, the system moved to correct itself. When the officials arrived, their presence alone was enough to make it clear that the misconduct had not gone unnoticed. The one who had commanded absolute control over the courtroom only moments before now found themselves under the scrutiny of the very system they had manipulated. It was a moment of reckoning, a reminder that power without accountability was an illusion. The weight of the situation settled over everyone present. This wasn't a minor lapse in judgment. It was a complete betrayal of the role that had been entrusted to someone who was supposed to embody fairness. The arrogance that had been so evident only minutes earlier was now replaced with the unmistakable look of someone who realized that consequences could no longer be avoided. The shift was sudden, jarring even, as the authority figure went from the enforcer of law to the one facing its full force. Those who had watched injustice play out in real time now bore witness to a different kind of justice, one that acted swiftly and without hesitation. There were no impassioned speeches, no chance to argue or defend what had just occurred. The same rules that had applied to countless others before now applied here as well, and there was no escaping them. The courtroom, which had been momentarily tainted by misuse of power, was reclaiming its purpose, ensuring that no one, no matter their position, was above the very laws they once upheld. News of what had transpired in the courtroom spread faster than anyone could have anticipated. What had started as a legal proceeding had escalated into an event that no one could ignore. It wasn't just about the outcome of the case anymore. It was about something far greater, something that touched on the very foundations of justice and accountability. The public, already weary of the growing concerns over unchecked authority, had been given a moment that perfectly encapsulated their fears. Across the country, people reacted with a mixture of shock, anger, and, for some, a sense of vindication. Conversations erupted in homes, workplaces, and public spaces as people tried to process what had happened. It wasn't often that those in positions of power faced consequences so swiftly, and it served as a stark reminder that even those who sat in judgment over others were not beyond scrutiny. For too long, there had been whispers of misconduct, stories of authority figures acting as though the rules didn't apply to them. And now, before the eyes of the nation, those whispers had turned into undeniable proof. Social media platforms became flooded with reactions, each post dissecting the details of the courtroom spectacle. Videos of the moment quickly went viral, replayed millions of times as people analyzed every expression, every movement. Some expressed disbelief that such a blatant display of misconduct had occurred in what was supposed to be a place of fairness. Others, more cynical, argued that this was merely the tip of the iceberg, a single exposure of a problem that ran much deeper than one isolated event. The legal community found itself at the center of the discussion, forced to address the growing demand for reforms. Prominent voices in law and politics weighed in, some expressing outrage, others attempting to downplay the significance of what had happened. But no matter the stance, one thing was undeniable: the trust in the system had been shaken. People no longer wanted reassurances, they wanted action. They wanted to know that this wasn't just an exception, that the system was capable of holding its own accountable. Protests and demonstrations began forming in several cities, with signs demanding greater oversight and stricter regulations. The message was clear: the public was watching, and they would not allow this moment to be forgotten. Discussions of ethics and judicial conduct, once reserved for academic debates, had now entered the mainstream. The idea that those in power should be subject to the same rules as everyone else was no longer just a talking point. It was an expectation, a demand that could not be ignored. As investigations into the incident unfolded, it became clear that the consequences would extend beyond one individual. The conversation had shifted from a singular act of misconduct to a broader examination of the institutions that allowed it to happen in the first place. The public had made their stance known. Accountability was not optional, and justice was not meant to serve only those who wielded it. The aftermath of the courtroom incident was unlike anything seen in recent memory. What had begun as a moment of misconduct quickly turned into a national reckoning. The events of that day could not be dismissed or forgotten. They had been witnessed by too many, recorded and replayed across news channels and social media platforms. The public had been given a front-row seat to something that many had suspected for years, but rarely saw play out so openly: an abuse of power met with immediate consequences. In the days that followed, the legal and political worlds were forced to confront a reality they could no longer ignore. The swift action taken against the misconduct sent a clear message, one that resonated far beyond the walls of the courtroom. It was a reminder that no one, regardless of their status or position, was beyond accountability. Those who had long benefited from a system that often looked the other way now had to face the uncomfortable truth that times were changing. The response from the public was intense and unrelenting. Calls for transparency and oversight reached a fever pitch, with citizens demanding reforms that would prevent such abuses from happening again. The pressure extended beyond just one individual. It reached institutions that had long operated, under the assumption that their authority would never be questioned. Petitions were signed, investigations were launched, and lawmakers found themselves at the center of a conversation that was growing louder by the day. For those who had always believed in the integrity of the judicial system, the incident was a painful but necessary awakening. It forced the country to acknowledge the cracks in the foundation, the places where power had gone unchecked for far too long. But it also served as a testament to the strength of a system that, when functioning properly, could correct itself. The swift action taken was proof that justice could prevail, even when the wrongdoing came from within. The fallout was not limited to legal circles. It rippled into public discourse, igniting discussions in classrooms, workplaces, and homes. What did justice truly mean if those tasked with upholding it could betray it so easily? Could the public trust that such an event would not repeat itself? These were not new questions, but they had never felt so urgent. The incident had transformed them from theoretical concerns into immediate demands. As the dust settled, one undeniable truth remained. The nation had witnessed a moment of reckoning. It was not just about one person or one courtroom. It was about the principle that no one should be immune from the rules they impose on others. In a time when trust in institutions was fragile, this moment served as both a warning and an opportunity. History would remember what happened that day, not just as an isolated scandal, but as a turning point. Whether it led to lasting change or faded into another forgotten controversy depended not just on lawmakers and officials, but on the people who refused to let justice be a privilege reserved for a select few.